Thank you for our staff or whoever is running this show decided to shorten the 1,000 standing around period, so that we're going to start at 4:30 instead of 5. Now, Steve Meyer is, an old friend of the family. Actually, we've known him since the 1989 when he met him at the famous Pajaro Dunes. Except they brought the English-speaking people there pronounce it Pajaro, and we decided this is someone we wanted to know, our son who's here tonight. And when he received his PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge, and he now directs Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture in Seattle. And he knows a bit about the science. I don't know so much about the culture part. Roberto would be happy to enlighten them about that. And he's written a New York Times bestseller called Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of the Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. Then another one called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, and then the latest one is called The Return of the God Hypothesis. Now, what he's been working on the most is something called information theory, where could the information necessary to program a cell, which is very much like an assembled machine. My son, when he was a child, had a little book about that, and they didn't seem to catch what the implications of what they were doing.
I still have that book somewhere.
Yeah, and he's been given the task of introducing David Berlinski. Although I went to one of Berlinski's what's in, he lives in Paris, France, of all places, I think I made it. So Steve will now introduce the Berlinski hypothesis.
Yeah, my bio tonight is really irrelevant. Our main speaker tonight is David Berlinski, who's come from Paris. He's one of our senior fellows at the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. David has a really amazing background and a life's work of achievements. He was born in this country in 1942 in February, just after World War II started. And in our interview, he's going to give a talk tonight. Then we'll have a little time for Q&A, and then I'm going to interview him, and you'll learn more about his family background in the interview, which is an amazing story. He was born in New York, then went to a prestigious high school called Bronx Science, where many very well-known and famous scientists of the last 50 years have gone to high school. Interestingly, one high school produced a number of very famous scientists. Then on to Princeton, eventually getting his PhD in philosophy, did a postdoc in molecular biology at Brandeis. It was Columbia. And he is now the author of 17 books, and almost all of them have been published with the elite New York publishing houses, with the exception of a couple of books with a very up-and-coming new press called Discovery Institute Press. And we're very proud of the books he's done with us. And he'll be talking tonight about his latest book called Science After Babel. A couple other things I just want to say about David is in I think it was 91, 92, something like that, he debated Richard Dawkins. And as a result of that debate, Dawkins took about a 20-year break from debates. And he didn't debate again until he finally was lured out by John Lennox, and he hasn't debated anyone since then either. So, but David had a huge impact on the discussion about Darwinian evolution. He published a very famous essay in 1996, which is how he came to our attention, in Commentary magazine. And it produced a ream of letters in response and debate back and forth through several issues of the magazine. And we'll be talking a little bit about that in our interview as well. But I'm especially pleased to introduce him because I met him almost, well, it'll be about 25 years ago. It was in '98. It was at the Holiday Inn at La Mirada. There was a conference at Biola called Mere Creation, and all of us were a bit in awe of Dr. Berlinski. He was holding forth in the lobby of the hotel, and there were people peppering him with questions, and it was that was my first meeting. At Yale, a few years later, I met him again, and we've been friends ever since, and our friendship has grown and deepened. What I love about David is when I tell people about him, I always say he's one of the most authentic people I know. He really cares about the truth, and he cares about things that matter. And I think many of you are here tonight because you care about the truth and things that matter. And we know that people, that those things are in short supply these days in our culture. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce my dear friend David Berlinski to you tonight.
Thank you so very much, Steve. And thank you all for coming. It's just a pleasure to see everybody in the audience. I have a few remarks, really based on the title of my last book, Science After Babel.
Sorry. Get it out. Actually, I think we just need to boost the audio levels. I think already booked up with.
I'd like to focus just very briefly on the magnificent painting of the Tower of Babel by Peter Bruegel the Elder. I'm sorry you can't see it in complete detail, but you should be able to recognize certain features. I'll bring up a slightly larger version. The thing is incoherent. It's incoherent in the sense it's not clear where it's going. And it's inconsistent in the sense that the different parts seem to be drawn to different designs. And it's incomplete in the obvious sense that half of the structure remains to be finished. Now, in the Bible, all of this has a tremendously important significance because the architects originally in the book of Genesis proposed the construction of a tower that would reach the heavens. And God, seeing this act of audacity, but also of arrogance, confounded the architects by dividing their languages. And the secret to the tower that Bruegel captures is the fact that various parts are designed by architects who do not speak the same language. Even though we are now speaking the same language, I beg you to consider that affirmation as a statement that captures something about life in the early part of the 21st century. So many of us do not anymore seem to be speaking the same language. For example, I give you a phrase that I've always found just remarkable in its suggestiveness. Only 3 words. The first time I heard this particular expression, trust the science, I never knew whether it was an exhortation or a threat. And I thought, I may be forgiven a childhood memory. I remember my mother, German was the first language I heard. My mother always said to me, morgen, morgen, nur nicht heute sagen, alle faulen Leute, which means tomorrow and tomorrow. That's what every lazy slob says. But when I lived in Vienna, I realized that in Germany, it was intended as a warning. Morgen, morgen, nur nicht heute. Tomorrow, tomorrow, not today. But in Vienna, a point of encouragement. tomorrow and tomorrow, don't worry about it. I think something like that is true in our culture as well. But trust the science, in my own experience, compares favorably with the second proverb. Your check is in the mail, and I must say I found both of inordinate usefulness. Trust the science when I'm unable to win a debate, and your check is in the mail when I'm unable to meet my creditors. Wonderfully useful as points of discussion. The result of trust the science, the result of a kind of dissecting pattern in culture where trust the science remains as a point of affirmation at a time when one doesn't really wish to trust anything else. And even with trust the science, one is not quite sure what one is trusting. There's so many debates, contemporary debates, ranging from COVID-19, vaccine effectiveness, Dr. Fauci, transgenderism, and global warming. Don't want to miss global warming. The result has been a kind of cultural debris. Atheism, materialism, scientism, physicalism, humanism, wokeism, transhumanism. God only knows what these terms mean. Here's an example. David Chalmers is a very well-respected philosopher, and explaining what it is to be natural, he says, I want everything to be natural, reduced to the simplest possible set of laws and entities, from which I deduce that stuff happens should answer every one of his epistemological and metaphysical demands. 2 words, 1 substance. What could be more natural? I'm persuaded, trust the science. You may remember David Chalmers, or you may have heard of David Chalmers, because he became famous when he said, apropos of nothing important, consciousness is a hard problem. I guess. One of the hard problems is figuring out what he meant. But if you trust the science, you have a head start. What does the science say about consciousness? Nothing. Here's something from a Harvard physicist, Lisa Randall, who happens to be a very good physicist. Quantum field theory, that's the basic object in physics, is based on eternal, omnipresent objects that can create and destroy particles. My goodness, sounds like an Indian deity, like Vishnu with 17 arms, capable of doing anything. But this is also a matter of trusting the science. Lisa Randall is professor of physics at Harvard University, and she's telling us that something like an Indian deity is running the universe. I can't argue. I suppose neither can you, but the relevantly important question is, why would you want to? Needless to say, this view, the universe being run by certain Indian deities, Indian physicists find remarkably congenial. They're on the best of terms with Lisa Randall. Here's a philosopher, pure philosopher, who explains just why you should trust the science as vigorously as possible. The motivating idea is that our world is at bottom. Does our world have a bottom? Physical, and that all higher level phenomena are products of a complex organization and interplay of underlying physical processes. This is a very, very common kind of asseveration. I don't understand a word, and I don't believe you do either. That too is swallowed in Science After Babel, because it's the sort of thing that people instinctively, habitually, and automatically say without ever once thinking about why they're saying it. Take any particular instantiation. Our world is at bottom physical, and everything is the product of complex organization and interplay of underlying physical processes. I suppose everybody in this room has signed a contract at one time or another. If you say contracts are at bottom, the interplay of complex organization of underlying physical processes, would you give the person saying that the time of day? Obviously, contracts are not the product of elementary particles in conflict. You cannot deduce the doctrine of consideration and contract law from quantum field theory. It's just not possible. That's kind of a tour of a horizon. In the 17th century, which is a very, very interesting moment in the history of our culture, Galileo remarked that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. At the very same time, and this is the interesting part, this is the deliciously human part, London was swarming with astrologers. William Lilly, for example, who in 1630 heard that there was money to be got in London by being an astrologer. So he rushed to London and he became an astrologer. What's really interesting about the history of astrology and the history of physics, because they're tightly coordinated, is that the astrologers, by and large, were very successful. They made a lot of money. And they didn't make it just once, they made it over a period of 30 or 40 years. William Lilly made himself a wealthy man. He wrote a 13-volume tract called Principles of Christian Astrology because he didn't want to get in trouble with the English church. I've read it. It reveals everything about his success except how he managed it. Some astrologers specialized in finding lost objects, like keys. Others provided very rudimentary gynecological services for London women. They're very strange. I mean, how do you explain that? Astrology and gynecological disease. It doesn't seem to fit very naturally, but there it is anyway. Every year they had a wonderful dinner. All the astrologers gathered. They drank one another's health. They ate enormous platters of beef and venison. And in 1685, Newton published the Principia Mathematica, which really originated the modern era, modern scientific era. The astrologers disappeared. They were no more seen in London. I've talked to historians about that, and to a man they say, oh no, there's no connection. The astrologers didn't read Newton, they couldn't read Latin, they were charlatans and frauds. No. What really happened in the 17th century for the first time, we saw the enormous social power of a new movement in thought, that is physics, theoretical physics. It simply swept everything before it. This is something to remember in the 21st century as well, because very similar currents are at work, very important things are apt to disappear, and very important things are apt to be developed with a minatory power we cannot at this moment assess. For example, ChatGPT-4. I assume all of you have played around as I have. There's obviously something new going on there. The doctrine that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics has two interpretations. If you listen to it carefully, you could mean the book in nature, the book that's revealed by the natural world, which is the way astrology developed. The astrologers were specialized in reading the book in nature. They looked at the sky, they saw something like sentences, they certainly saw signs. They were skilled in the interpretation of these signs. Here's a wonderful story from the court astrologer for the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal is one of those mysterious figures. We know him best because he suffered terribly from depression. And the only person he could talk to when he was depressed was his court astrologer. And the court astrologer said, Majesty, isn't one day long enough not to eat anything and mope around? And then he goes on to explain what the stars have in mind for Ashurbanipal. Said, the stars are sending you a warning. Snap out of it. Don't be so morose. And that was his role, to read the sky and tell the king what those signs indicated. That's the book in nature. But there's a second way of thinking of Galileo's remark, that is a book about nature. And the book about nature is the book of nature. It's something written down. It's something written down by us. It's a completely different kind of book. The physicists read the book of nature. They don't read the book in nature. The idea of a book in nature has obvious theological implications. Many of them extremely moving, extremely pertinent, and all of them relevant to modern science. The Christian view, adumbrated, say, by Albertus Magnus in the 13th century, is that God is everywhere conserving the world. Two extremely important points. This is a principle of conservation, which later will bloom completely in theoretical physics. But what is the word everywhere doing? It's an interesting question. Why is God everywhere? In Catholic theology, this becomes the doctrine of the ubiquity of the body of Christ. Why does Christ's body find itself everywhere? It's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question. I mean, God is God. Why is it necessary for him to be everywhere? Albertus Magnus has an interesting discussion which illuminates that. Fascinating figure. He asks himself, you know, they're angels, right? And the angels want to talk to one another. How do they do it? Well, they don't really have vocal tracts. They don't have an elaborate physical instrument. And if they're separated, Albertus Magnus says, that would be like asking a lighthouse in Italy to send a signal to a lighthouse in England. It's not possible for the angels. And he comes up with an extraordinarily interesting idea. He said, one angel has an idea, and instantly every other angel knows it. What is this if not quantum mechanical entanglement? It's quantum mechanics. This is the 13th century, the same idea. And the same problem. Without something like entanglement, we're lost in the wilderness of action at a distance, which so bedeviled Newton in the 18th century. This is a quite different tradition, but the same thought. Whatever God wills happens, and whatever he does not will, does not. It's a famous incantation in Islamic thought. But the same idea is at work. Some principle of conservation must be applicable to the universe. Why? Because without that principle and without the intention that lies behind it, the universe would collapse. This is what this Quranic injunction is telling you. This is why God must obey a principle of conservation. This way of thinking reaches its apotheosis in Exodus when Moses is granted communion with God by means of a burning bush. He doesn't see God face to face. That's forbidden. Any man who looks at God in his face must die. But he hears God's voice through a burning bush. And the triumphant exhortation when Moses asks God for his name is simply the declaration, I am that I am. Another great reader of the cosmos revealed in the book of Exodus. And finally, there is an Islamic verse which suggests, again, that the world is being held up through the active intervention, at every moment for that matter, just as in certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, the world splits at every moment. Everything will be destroyed except his face. That is the principle. The face of God keeps the world in perfect suspension. That is the book in nature. But that's no longer our book. That belongs to the perpetual inventory of remembered things. It's no longer an article of rationality, of scientific faith. All of these religious injunctions, imprecations, commandments are touching on a mystery that I think the intelligent design movement is also touching on. When we talk about the conservation of the world, upholding the world, preventing the world from collapsing into chaos, impressing on material and physical objects their necessary structure, what upholds the world, there is an argument to be made, cannot itself be a part of the world. It's a very interesting theological point. What upholds the world cannot be a part of the world, because if it were a part of the world, it would be vulnerable to something like Aristotle's third man argument. If something is in the world and it's upholding the world, what's upholding the thing that's upholding the world? So it has to be beyond. Very interesting point. What we will see is that this vanished world, part of the perpetual inventory, represents what Freud called the return of the repressed. It comes back within theoretical science itself. And that's something absolutely fascinating. There's no getting rid of certain ideas. I'll try to explain what I have in mind. We're now talking about the book of nature. And that is a book. Books of this sort are human artifacts made of ink or computer code, sets of sentences in the end, true or false, better or worse, elegant or clumsy, consistent or complete, both or neither. We know what books are. And theoretical physics is, in the end, a book. It's written down, or computer code. It's just there between the hard covers of a standard text. It's not out in nature. It's a book. No worse for that, but it is terribly important to recognize that science is a matter of writing something down, just the way we write love letters, sonnets, contracts, legal documents, wills, codicils. Theoretical physics, mathematics, same thing. Belongs to the same category. Niels Bohr was one of the preeminent physicists of the 20th century. A man who ordinarily was very difficult to understand. He had a remarkable take on the book-like nature of physics. He said, "It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is." That's pretty remarkable coming from a physicist. Imagine Richard Feynman saying something like that. Now, it's not my business to tell you how magnetism works. I'm just interested in writing books. Feynman would never say anything like that. That's why Bohr is a very great physicist. He said, physics concerns what we can say about nature. What we can say about nature. That is very, very different from what the astrologers or the theologians would say. No astrologer would say, my writ extends to the end of the horoscope and then my work is done. No. They were actively out there engaged with nature, reading the heavens. But Niels Bohr, and I think he's entirely correct, saying physics, the real subject of physics, theoretical physics, the real subject of mathematics, is what we put down on the page, what we say about nature. And here comes the return of the repressed. If you agree with Niels Bohr that our sciences really are stuff that you can find in books, right? And the answer to all the imperatives and all the constraints of a written text. Does it make sense? Is it consistent? Is it complete? Does a premise lead to a conclusion? Is the logic reasonable? Is something intolerably ambiguous? Is it vague? Those are the constraints we place on books, not constraints we place on nature. But in the end, the pull of the doctrine of a book in nature proves very, very strong. Let me give you an example. Brian Greene is a very, very good physicist, a specialist in string theory. He teaches at Columbia University, and he wrote a book recently. And This is what he had to say. I want you to attend to the italicized words. Everything emerges from the same collection of ingredients. Oh, we heard that before. Everything, bottom up, comes bubbling up, just like when you make good coffee. Governed by the same physical principles. The laws that govern your next move, the laws governing inanimate collection, the laws have total control. The laws of nature are both immune to flattery, incapable of loosening the reins. Schrodinger's equation chisels its intention into stone. Just imagine what Schrodinger's equation would do if given access to Mount Rushmore. God only knows. The point is, this is clearly a category mistake. If I write Newton's supreme law, force equals mass times acceleration on the blackboard, and say, go govern something, what am I going to get? Go govern. Say something, do something. No, it's not going to happen. Governing is a human or a divine attribute. It's human, we govern one another, we govern ourselves. But it's not a property of something written down in a book. Force equals mass times acceleration is a sentence, and sentences are habitually not in the business of governing anything. This is just a clumsy category mistake, but modern science is filled with it. It's just filled with it. See, to an extraordinary extent in Darwinian theory, Darwin's theory of evolution, natural selection is given what are obviously theistic powers to influence events. Gains control of a species, it shapes, it molds, it instructs, it divides, it conquers. This is absolutely absurd. Darwin's theory is written down somewhere. Whether it explains anything or not is a perfectly prosaic question. My own feeling is no. Other people may have a different opinion, but natural selection is not a force doing anything. It's something written down. The plain fact of the matter is the laws do what they do. The world is what it is, and nothing is governing anything. That's the plain fact of the matter. But there is a much deeper level of perplexity at work, best suggested by a remark by Lord Keynes. He said, he was writing about the 1930s, which were a terrible period. He said, every nutty doctrine, every preposterous view of the universe has its origins in some academic scribbler. He was thinking principally about Marxist and economics departments, things like that. It has its origins in some academic scribbler. I think that's true. I think that's very true. What Lord Keynes did not consider was the possibility that many contemporary doctrines do have their origins in some lamentable academic scribbler, but the scribblers may have been right. That's the tricky part. The scribblers may have been right. For example, when I was starting graduate school, or even when I was starting college in 1959, nobody ever heard of Gödel's incompleteness theories. Nobody heard of Alonzo Church or Alan Turing. It was not part of the contemporary culture. When I got to graduate school, still, it was a total mystery. A few people in the logic department knew that Alonzo Church was a very, very significant logician, but nobody knew, nobody had a prayer of understanding what he did. And Gödel's monumental paper from 1931 wasn't even translated into English until 30 years later. Now we see a completely revised view of the intellectual scenario of modern science, where the work of the 1930s by Gödel, by Turing, by Emil Post, by Alonzo Church is fundamental. But almost 100 years had to pass before that was clear. The remarks I want to make now do have their origin in work that was undertaken in the early part of the 20th century, the 1920s, the 1930s. It appeared, it was looked at, it was considered. A few specialists chuckled over the results, but the full force did not become clear until much, much later. They're just now becoming clear. And unfortunately, they're becoming clear in a very vulgarized form, as when someone 18 years old with blue hair and nose rings starts talking about my truth. God forbid that I support her in her declaration, but she's got a point, alas. And I want to explain why she has a point and how the point emerges. When one thinks about the book of nature, one thinks very naturally of theoretical physics, not mathematical physics, that's something else, but theoretical physics, theoretical biology. And one has, I think, a kind of natural view. You write down what you think is going on. Just like this. Sentences, conservation laws, principles of gravity, principles of symmetry. And the idea at the back of your mind is that somehow what you've written or expressed or put into a computer code reaches out and grabs the world. I mean, we find ourselves at a loss if our language, our way of proceeding, doesn't have at least a tentative adhesion to the world beyond it. It's very difficult to entertain that hypothesis. I mean, I have never met somebody who believes completely in solipsism, for example, but something like epistemological solipsism is required if you believe that between the book of nature and nature itself, there is no glue, there's no adhesion, there's no fastener, there's nothing hooking on. And in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein's early masterpiece, he wrote it in 1918 after serving 4 years in the trenches, he says that language is essentially a picture of reality. Just as a picture and what it depicts have a certain relationship, so language and what it depicts has the same relationship. And Wittgenstein goes on to say, that's how it happens. That's the adhesion. That's the glue. We say something, we write a sentence, we express ourselves clearly, and bang, it just attaches to the world. But that's not true. And we know now that's not true by means of a very simple argument, which can be expressed technically, a very simple argument. What have I done? Which gives you an idea of how very difficult the contemporary terrain really is. We like to think, along with Ben Shapiro, that facts don't care about your feelings, right? It's always in dialogue with some hapless student who's talking about his or her feelings. And Ben Shapiro, no. Facts don't care about it. Facts are what they are. Not true. There are no facts. Or better put, all true sentences picture the same fact, and all false sentences picture the same fact. This is a very, very powerful conclusion. It means, Ben, you're wrong. Facts don't care about your feelings because there are no facts. There are no facts of the matter. The world is not structured in terms of facts. And I want to give you the argument. It's an ordinary language argument, but I could reproduce it in set theory. No gain, really. And if you find yourself dismayed by the argument and its implications, I think you have every reason to think as you do. Because I find myself dismayed. I certainly want to think that we live in a world of facts, we live in a world of right and wrong, we live in a world of incontrovertible pieces of evidence. We live in a world that does not much care what we say about it. But consider this a very simple argument, which I'm using this to show an iron curtain descending between what we say and what there is. just repeating what I've just said. Let's take a simple sentence. Sir Walter Scott is the author of Waverley. There's nothing mysterious about that sentence. I could say to you, you know exactly what I mean, right? Sir Walter Scott, author of Waverley, hideously boring novel. It happens to be true, right? So there should be a fact. There should be a fact behind it. There should be a fact that makes it true. Now I'm going to show you there is no such fact beyond the general fact of the truth. Sir Walter Scott is the author of Waverley really means the same thing as Sir Walter Scott is the man who wrote 29 Waverley novels altogether. It's the same fact, right? Sir Walter Scott's the author of Waverley. Right. This is the guy who wrote 29 Waverley novels altogether. We're not saying anything new. Now I've changed it slightly. The number is such that Sir Walter Scott wrote that many Waverley novels altogether is 29. True. Same sense. I mean, you can understand what I'm saying. I'm saying the same thing three different ways. But now if I look at the phrase, the number such that Sir Walter Scott wrote that many Waverley novels altogether, I can come up with an entirely different sentence. That also designates the number of counties in Utah. You can repeat this with every true sentence. So insofar as Sir Walter Scott, the author of Waverley, has a relationship of companionability with a fact, it is exactly the same fact as the number of counties in Utah is 29. The only conclusion, it's a reductio ad absurdum, the only conclusion to draw is there are no facts. If there are no facts, nothing makes these statements true. Nothing makes them false. And maybe, in a way that we do not at all understand, the blue-haired, nose-ring-pierced young woman who talks about my truth may have been in spiritual contact with the eminent logicians of the 1930s, because she is really depending on an argument just like this. She's depending on this kind of argument, which we are just now, in 2024, coming to understand has a tremendous moral and intellectual significance. It's not the only case, but there are a whole series of comparable cases. For example, we are certainly approaching the end of theoretical science in favor of data-driven science. That's something that can be traced back to the 1940s. Certain body of technical results in the 1940s by Craig, a logician named Craig, my old professor, Professor Hempel, indicates that theoretical science is a luxury. If we had enough data, we wouldn't need it. I could go through a long list, 10 or 20 comparable anomalies, where the whole structure does really suggest science after Babel. The thing is incomplete, it's incoherent, it's inconsistent. Not a bad thing, but not a good thing either. Because certainly a certain portion of moral force is being withdrawn from the Great Tower. Because we cannot find a way to reconcile the book of nature with the book in nature in a way that makes complete sense. This is the task of the next century, to do just that. And with that, I'll leave you. Thank you very much.
You and I get to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And then audience members, after that short Q&A, we'll have a little break for refreshments, and then David and I will come back and have an interview, have yet more questions. I'd like to talk about the laws of nature.
Go right ahead.
And I want to start with a story from my own graduate days. I was doing a a research paper on Newton and the conflict between Newton and Leibniz over universal gravitation. And in David's book, Newton's Gift, the introduction to that book is worth the entire price of admission because you write about that interesting controversy in the history of science. In brief, Newton formulates a theory of gravity that implies that there is force being transmitted through empty space without any material interaction between, for example, the moon and the tides on planet Earth. The moon is somehow affecting the Earth, transmitting a gravitational force, but there's no mechanical pushing or pulling. Leibniz didn't like that idea. He said it was bringing occult forces back into science, and he actually accused him of bringing theology back into science, that the only way that would make sense is if there was a God behind the universe who was responsible for maintaining this consistent mathematical force that he described with his law of gravity. My supervisor said that Newton believed in constant spirit action. The ultimate explanation for gravitational force was that God was ordering the universe in a very specific way that accounted for that transmission of force across a distance. And I had a memorable interaction with the supervisor who knew I was a theist. He was a this was Simon Schaffer, who was a radical scientific, a sociologist of science who believed that there were no objective truths about the world. And he said, there are three views of the laws of nature. You've articulated them really well tonight. There's the view that the laws of nature are a metaphor expressing how God orders the world. There's an interesting essay in the history of science by a man named Edward Zilsel, who says that the concept of the law of nature was a juridical metaphor of theological origin. So when we talk about the laws of nature in the period of the scientific revolution, it was about that those laws were an expression of how God was ordering the world. And he said, that's your view, my supervisor pointed to me. He said, and that makes sense. He said, my view is that the laws of nature are just, as David's been describing, descriptions. But they have no, what was your memorable phrase, David? They have no adhesion to the world. And he says, that view makes sense. The one view, he said, that doesn't make sense is the view that's held by the physics department across the street and most of the other philosophers in this department, which is that the laws of nature are things that cause things to happen. When, as you showed on the board, F equals MA doesn't govern anything.
It's a category.
It's a category mistake.
Governance belongs to human interaction where intentions are formed and executed, where constraints are placed. We know what it is to govern other people, govern ourselves, govern nature. We don't know what it is for a sentence or a set of sentences to be in the business of government. That's just not what a sentence does. It's just not what laws of nature do. And Brian Greene has succumbed to a very understandable exercise in which the repressed, which is essentially religious, makes a very dramatic return. Instead of talking about God as everywhere conserving the world, Brian Greene says, well, the laws of nature are doing it everywhere. It's not much of a difference, is there? If you're assigning that kind of power to the laws of nature, we might as well worship them, since they seem to be able to do anything that God could have done. And exactly.
And almost all physicists talk this way.
Every physicist alive,
Yeah.
except for
A few. Yeah. Well, and there are things that are philosophically more sensitive, but yeah, it raises a really interesting. Here's an analogy that I've sometimes used with students to get this across. If we have the longitude and latitude lines on the map. They're descriptions of geographical places on the planet. To say that the laws of nature are causing things to happen is kind of like saying that the longitude and latitude lines on the map are causing the continents to be where they are. They're our descriptions. They're not things that make things happen. Is that the key point you're making?
It is a key point, and I think it's an extremely important point because it begins to reverberate throughout the culture. One of the things that we might discuss It's a huge topic. Is how do ideas propagate in human societies? I don't think we really understand it. How do cultures form? How do ideas go into circulation? How does one idea influence another idea? Bishop Berkeley said that the only thing that can cause a belief or cause a belief to change is another belief. The only thing that influences an idea is another idea. It's a very serious form of idealism in terms of sociology. I don't think we have a convincing causal or sociological explanation for the fact that ideas that were very, very dimly known from 1931 to 1944, when the first computers came into existence, have somehow reached out into the culture at large and started influencing people who have no idea who Turing was, who Church was, what the Gödel incompleteness theorems mean. No idea whatsoever, but they're now talking as if they were deeply informed by a graduate level course in mathematical logic. It's very strange. I don't know why one of Ben Shapiro's interlocutor doesn't come back with that response. I stand by Gödel, Turing, Church, and Post. That's my answer. That's my truth. But it seems not to have occurred to anyone because it's on a level way below the threshold of consciousness. Way below.
Let's talk a little bit more about this subjective turn in science. There are lots of philosophers that were in my department in Cambridge who were relativists about science. They called themselves sociologists of science.
Sure.
Their maxim was whoever gets the grant makes the theory. And there's
something to that.
There is something to that. But is it really the case that there is no adhesion between our scientific descriptions of the world and the world itself? And what I'd like to ask you about is the shift in perspective that has come from the period of Newton and the scientific revolution, where these metaphors were understood, the book of nature, the laws of nature, the idea that nature was a clockwork, all these things were understood. They were theological in orientation. And because of that, the early scientists believed that there was an intelligibility about nature, that when they were describing it, there was the possibility that their descriptions did have adhesion, that it was describing something real. And I wonder to what extent do you think that in addition to some of these logical problems, that yes, thank you, Howard, that there's a philosophical and theological shift that's also responsible for this relativism that we now, which is creating the science after Babel, that if you lose the theological or theistic foundation of that the early scientists had, does that then inevitably lead to a loss of confidence in the intelligibility of nature, and therefore to some of this subjectivism you're describing?
For sure. I would hesitate to say that I have a very rigorous argument. It's just an overwhelming feeling that this is so.
Yeah.
But I do want to stress one point. I think it's a mistake to talk about biology failing to have adhesion to the world. It's the wrong idea. That's not the job of a theory. It can certainly adhere to other parts of the book. What we're really talking about is how successful an explanation is, and this is an idea internal to the description of nature, say, in terms of any of the sciences. Nobody is being asked to give up the idea that certain things are true, other things are false. Nobody's being asked to give up on the idea that certain explanations are good and certain explanations are just rotten. But these are internal to theories. They're not based on the ability, the miraculous or the supernatural ability of a purely human product, usually written in mathematical form, to find an adhesive interpretation in a world of facts that does not exist. A great deal can be rescued by simply acknowledging that, as in so many areas of life, what we thought was a recognition of some blinding physical reality was really partially internal, determined by our constitution, our nature, our previous beliefs, our attitudes, our velities, and that so it is with theoretical physics or theoretical biology. We create very elaborate structures, but we do that with sonnets, we do that with Shakespearean drama as
An
well.
explanation and description.
We have explanations, we have descriptions, we have a very delicate apparatus that gives us a tiny bit of addition. But nothing is destroyed by thinking of science far more a humble human undertaking, like contract law, than a supernatural undertaking in which the physicist somehow is able to read the book of nature and assume godlike powers over the world.
And thus proclaim to the rest of the culture that science is settled.
Trust
or,
the science.
Or trust the science, or talk about consensus science.
Yeah.
All the things that we've heard very recently. So in a sense, what you're encouraging us to recognize some limits of science and to have a more humble approach to our epistemology, our understanding of how we know what we know, and therefore not to always trust the science because it's a human endeavor that can be fallible.
Exactly right. I mean, how could science be without limits if it's created by human beings? And if a theoretical physicist says that he has access to the thoughts of God, well, that's an interesting example of
Hubris.
intellectual arrogance.
Yeah.
A lot of very, very smart people have had exactly that kind of hubris. You know, Ramanujan, the great Indian number theorist, said, an equation doesn't interest me unless it expresses a thought in the mind of God. Well, I can tell you, I can point to a lot of equations that are clearly not thoughts in the mind of God, which are very interesting anyway. Einstein also said exactly the same thing, almost in the same words. The only thing that interests me is whether an equation represents a thought in God's mind. Everything else is just detail.
So let's one more thought, and then let's try to open it up for some questions. I'm very interested in how you started your talk and then how it ended, and then seeing now the connection. We have in the culture two really different concepts of science that are we have this idea of consensus-driven science, or trust the science, settled science. We hear that we're encouraged about so many controversies: Darwinism, global warming, the public health response to COVID, controversies in medicine. Many times the controversial propositions in those fields are swept aside, and the general public is told, trust the science.
Always,
science.
not many times, always.
Always. And yet, there's a wonderful Italian philosopher of science that you and I admire named Marcello O'Pera, who says that science advances as scientists argue about how to interpret the evidence. So there's two concepts. There's the concept of consensus-driven science and the concept of science as a dynamic enterprise that requires freedom of thought, freedom of expression, debate, argument. There's a rhetorical dimension. You have to argue about these descriptions and to what extent they do match what is the nature as it really is.
I think Ernst Mach had a slightly more morbid view of how science advances. He said science advances when one generation dies.
One funeral at a time. Yes,
One funeral at a time. And there's a lot of, I've seen it in my own life. I see changes taking place because the guys who are in charge of a discipline, certainly true in terms of biology, they died.
Yeah.
And the next generation did not have that daunting presence, that overhang of authority that really is crushing in the academic world. It's very, very difficult to avoid it or evade it.
Excellent, David. So let's open it up. We've got a few minutes for some questions now. Then we'll have a break for some refreshments, I think, and then we'll come back for a more extensive interview. Yes.
I so appreciate the concept that a sentence does not govern things. And yet, then how do we respond to someone who's questioning the Bible? Those sentences govern things.
Oh, we can be moved by something. We're human beings. We're not inanimate objects. Of course, to be or not to be immediately awakens something in your consciousness. When I look at the book of Exodus and the book of Genesis, of course you respond as a human being. But when Steve dropped the pen didn't drop because force equals mass times acceleration governed it. It just dropped. Human beings are not like anything else. And that's the thought that I think should be cherished and not opposed. We do recognize language. We do respond to language. We are moved by certain things. Certainly the same thing is true of music. I don't say it's only language. But the declaration, I am that I am, has a grandeur in every language. And we can explain it only partially, but we respond fully and completely. We know exactly what it means, even though we have a very difficult time explaining that.
I would add in the scientific realm that the universality of these mathematical descriptions of the great theories of physics does that those our statements of those laws don't govern anything. They seem to reflect something must be at work behind the universe that accounts for that universality. And the explanation that Newton and the early scientists gave was something like the passage in the book of Hebrews where it says that God sustains the universe by the word of his power. That there is something, and Newton used that kind of language in the general scholium to the Principia, his theological epilogue. So he had a profoundly theological vision of what he was doing with the physics. But we've lost that, and I think that's one of the things that's contributing to this subjectivism that we're finding in science, and maybe to the breakdown thing. For example, and David and I have talked a lot about how theoretical physics is coming to kind of an impasse. You've got all these...
Difficult to know what's going on in theoretical physics for two reasons. One, it's a huge subject. You can't be master of it all. The second is that it's quite a difficult subject. The impenetrability of much of theoretical physics is owing to the fact that theoretical physicists very often, and I'm speaking now from my perspective, are kind of slovenly when they come to their mathematical expressions. It's very hard to figure out what's going on. They're very satisfied with easy mathematics and very reluctant to prove anything rigorously, which is why I drew a distinction between mathematical physics, which is really a form of mathematics, and theoretical physics, which is an expression of the maxim, anything goes.
This gentleman over here, thank you.
Person trying to with
I can't see you.
as I'm referring to, you mentioned consciousness. I referred to Thomas Nagel seems to have agreed that consciousness cannot be explained by physicalism, and that there has to be some type of vertical or intelligibility to maybe this horizontal physical world. And here I'm kind of using a little bit of the language of some Plotinus scholars who kind of see Plotinus as doing a critical analysis of Plato here, where you have the physical world is horizontal and its intelligibility is vertical. And then Thomas Nagel he wants to hold on to atheism and materialism, but it seems like he can't get there without embracing some type of theism. But he seems to be trying to honestly tackle this problem.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know Tom Nagel, and we were friends for a while. You know, he wrote a very famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? I don't know why the essay is so famous. It seems to have touched a chord, evidence that a great many people were wondering, well, what is it like to be a bat? I've never found it a particularly vexing question, and I'm not sure what vexing problem it expresses. I kind of figure, be like a bat. I can get that experience by hanging from the shower curtain by my toes and sort of flapping my arms around. What do bats eat? I mean, worms. It doesn't seem worthwhile to pursue things on that trajectory. If that's the hard problem of consciousness, I'm not interested. You know, for many years I was editor of a journal, Inference, the International Review of Science, and we used to get a lot of papers on the Thomas Nagel wavelength. And I read Nagel's paper very carefully. He seems to feel that from the question you could derive the conclusion, there exists something such that that something is like being a bat. That never struck me as an argument of remarkable lucidity.
I was going to say it's more contemporary where he's convinced in consciousness, I would say, consistent with the Christian worldview, but without God and its incompatibility with naturalism.
Yeah,
Materialism.
another Brian Greene.
He seems to be trying to figure out, but he can't. That's why I had an insight to why he's still trying. He recognizes he can't make the connection, but he's still trying.
Can I add something there? I had David and...
Excuse me, Steve, can I close?
Yeah, you can close that.
Because I can't see it.
Some of you may know that Nagel's a famous atheistic philosopher from NYU, and a very, very great philosopher, an eminence in the American Academy. And he shocked everyone by writing some favorable things about David's work, critiquing Darwinism, about my book, Signature in the Cell. He got himself in a lot of hot water. There was a cover story of the Weekly Standard about the burning of a heretic in 2012 with Nagel's picture on it. In 2013, I was going to New York, and I emailed him and asked if he would like to meet for lunch. I thought probably he would say, no, I've had enough of you guys. It's causing me plenty of problems. To my surprise, he wanted to do the lunch. And over lunch, we talked quite a bit about David's work, but then also he asked me what I thought of his new book called Mind and Cosmos, how the neo-Darwinian materialist, yeah, that's what you're talking about, how the neo-Darwinian materialist view of origins is almost certainly false. And in that book, he developed this idea you're talking about. He called it naturalistic teleology. So he wanted to have some sense that there was a purpose to the universe, there was purpose to life, that you could see it in living organisms, but he wanted to root it in something naturalistic because he was still an atheist. And he asked me if I thought his idea of naturalistic teleology was incoherent. And I wasn't going to tell the great man that I thought it was incoherent. So what I said, which is what I do think, I said, I don't think it's incoherent, but it's inconsistent with our experience. We don't know anything that is not a mind that has purposes. And so to attribute purpose to matter, however you want to reconstitute your ideas of materialism, as Nagel was manfully doing,
Hey, how come I can't see you?
yeah. Anyway, I think you're right. I think there's a tension there. I don't think it really works. But it is a noble effort. And we appreciated Nagel for his honesty about recognizing the scientific problems that we've laid out with Darwinian evolution and origin of life studies and all these things that we've worked on. So,
well, let me just add to that based on my personal friendship with Tom Nagel. You know, I've lived a long time now. I have never met a real atheist. Never once. I don't believe in the existence of the category of atheism. I certainly don't believe that someone as confused as Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens ever was prepared to affirm something that I would recognize logically as atheism, namely the declaration, I believe that God does not exist. Inevitably, what they mean is, I don't have enough data, give me more data. I mean, typically what scientists say, I can't make up my mind. What they really mean is I haven't thought seriously about the question, and I'm a busy man. But I've never met an atheist, and I never thought that Tom Nagel was an atheist. He said some remarkably silly things to the effect that he certainly hopes atheism is true because he wouldn't want or wish to live in a world in which God exists. No, Tom, a lot of choice you have.
yeah. Well, he also has expressed dismay that some of the smartest people he knows are theists. I think in particular he was referring to his friend Alvin Plantinga, the great philosopher from Notre Dame, and we talked a fair bit about him at the lunch I had. This seems like a good place to take a break because we are in the next a segment after the break, a 30-minute break for refreshments and conversation. We're going to come back, and I'm going to do a more extensive interview with David, and we're going to be talking about, among other things, his book, The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions. So we can pick up on this theme.
I want to break long enough for a second.
You may have a cigarette.
Okay.
Permitted. We're gonna resume the program now. Thank you for the spirited conversation during the break, all the good questions we've already had. Now we have about 35 minutes for me to interview David in a little bit more comprehensive way about his life and work, and then we'll open it up for some further conversation and discussion. So, David, during the break, I had an interesting conversation with one of our guests who was asking about the connection between the Babel image and the physics discussion, and something crystallized in our conversation. I wanted to run it by you, see if we've got the idea accurately. So, as I understand it, you're saying there's a world out there that has certain properties, certain things it does, and there's the world of physics where we describe what the world out there is doing. And explain it. And we write those things down, and we forget that our descriptions are not governing what's happening there. And if we lose track of that and think that our descriptions have what the philosophers call ontological reality, they are somehow causing things to happen rather than merely describing it, we end up treating our physics as a kind of idol. We're back to the tower.
Not only an idol, but a theological idol.
A theological idol.
The idea of worshiping the laws of physics is very common in physics departments. They have a sacred character, and they inspire awe. They're interesting statements, and they're part of a very profound system of thought. There's no question about that. But they are like a Shakespearean sonnet or a Spencerian sonnet. They're things written down that serve a function, serve a certain purpose, have a certain environment in which they flourish, and another environment in which they don't flourish at all.
And so the point is not that they have no adhesion to the world, meaning they don't describe anything about the world accurately, but rather they're not causing things to happen.
They're not causal agents.
Yes.
I mean, certainly...
I have to tell you, that drives me nuts when I talk to physicists. They do not get this. They talk in a way that makes the laws of nature a kind of idol. You're right.
I mean, certainly it's true that we can use language to achieve effects in the world.
Right.
Your money or your life. That has a certain effect.
Right.
But that's not what the physicists mean when they talk about the governance.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about their theories as if they had omnipotence. That's just a silly way.
This was why I started with the story about my supervisor from grad school, because he was a very staunch atheist, a relativist, a radical relativist about science, but he understood that those metaphors came out of a specifically theological context.
For sure.
And in fact, he wagged his finger at me one time and he said, if you miss Newton's theism, you've missed everything.
But the theological context goes back to the 11th century.
Oh, right, and to your Albertus Magnus guy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, really. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so that's the hope that helps people crystallize the different parts of David's talk, because I think I love this new book he's got out about science after Babel. David is he's editor of a journal, an international review of science, so he loves science, but the way in which people can use it as an idol, or then also, once it becomes an idol in that way, use it as a source of authority and power to tell everybody else what they must do, as if its deliverances are beyond question. That then gets into a dangerous area for a culture. So, okay.
Well, I agree completely with that.
It doesn't surprise me. We talk about this on the phone all the time. I want to now begin in kind of with your beginning and go back to 1941. And your parents were musicians, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
Leipzig,
born in Leipzig.
Leipzig, where they were part of, your father at least, part of the Leipzig Philharmonic Orchestra?
No. They were, both my mother and father went to the Leipzig
Conservatory, okay.
of Music.
Of music.
Which was just a magnificent institution. I mean, my father studied with a student of a student of a student of a student of Bach. And they were both extremely well-trained classical musicians, both pianists. And my father actually had a flourishing career as a concert pianist in the years just before Hitler came to power in 1933 in Germany. And they were worshippers at a shrine that's not completely dissimilar to the shrine at which physicists worship. They worship music. They worshiped art. And I must say it was the tragedy of their life. The worship was mistaken. The artistic endeavor did not satisfy them at the deepest level. And that was the result of their expulsion first from Germany and then from France.
And so we'll get a little biological here. You're conceived in 1941. By this time your father is fighting in the French resistance?
It was 1940.
1940.
In the Foreign Legion.
He's in the Foreign Legion. And then he gets word from your brother, or his brother in London, that it's time to get out.
Get out.
Yeah.
At any cost.
And there was a particular gentleman named Fry, I believe, who was...
Varian Fry.
Yeah.
Varian Fry was a United States official based in Marseille who decided quite independently to prepare forged documents for fleeing Germans, chiefly Germans, who found themselves trapped in Marseille. And it was a very elaborate pantomime that he undertook, but almost all of the very distinguished figures, Hannah Arendt, Ernst Bloch, my parents as well, went through Varian Fry to obtain the very many documents that were needed. My father did have permission to enter the United States. What he lacked, even though he was a decorated veteran of the Foreign Legion, was permission to leave France and to enter Spain.
And so Varian Fry was instrumental. I think he was sent by Eleanor Roosevelt, was he not? He was
Sort of.
Okay. But prominent Jewish scientist, intellectually religious musician, physician, philosophers. He's helping them get out of the country.
For sure.
And your family benefited from that when your mother was pregnant with you.
Yeah, exactly.
And so how did they get out?
They finally got their after a year of agony in Marseille, because my father was on the Gestapo's wanted list, living hand to mouth in Marseille. They finally got Varian Fry's papers, and they were able to enter Spain. They crossed the Pyrenees on the
Pyrenees.
On foot, yeah. Almost everybody did. Walter Benjamin was the famous case. He crossed the Pyrenees, but he was rejected at the border because his papers were not up to date, so he committed suicide. There are thousands of stories like that. This was an especially hideous time. But then they went to Spain, which protected its Jews. There's not a single Spanish Jew who perished in the Holocaust. And they had to spend another 6 months waiting for a ship. And they finally boarded the Marquise de Camelia. It took 6 weeks to reach the United States because they were avoiding submarines the whole time. They didn't actually reach the United States, they reached Cuba.
You went to Cuba and then to
the
United States,
yeah.
And then you were born in Brooklyn.
No, Manhattan.
February ever 42? No, not Brooklyn. The Bronx. Something. One of those.
Manhattan.
Yeah, Manhattan. Okay.
He's a crucial class to excellence.
Yeah. All right. So by and by, you're raised with these wonderful artistic parents. I saw a video of your mother still playing in her late 90s, she lived a very long time. 101 years.
But don't forget, as soon as my parents came to the United States, my father was drafted in the American Army.
He served in both.
He was sent to Brooklyn to train recruits.
That's where I got the Brooklyn part. Yeah.
He was sent to Brooklyn. Of course, he didn't have a word of English, neither did my mother. And so he trained at least one division of American combat soldiers using Foreign Legion commandments. I mean, that whole division saluted like this instead of like that.
That's great.
It happens in wartime.
So you grow up in New York, and you tell us about Bronx Science. I mentioned that in your introduction. I would start out your story about that.
It was this enormous snobbish elite school. You had to pass a test to get into it. Absolutely nothing took place. I didn't learn a thing at Bronx Science. The only thing I discovered was that beyond any academic pursuit, I was interested, A, in being a bully, and B, in chasing girls. And I left Bronx Science unable to write a sentence in English, unable to execute a mathematical computation, completely ignorant of chemistry because we skipped all the chemistry classes, completely ignorant of physics because we also skipped the physics classes in order to go to the coffee shop and smoke. And when I came to Columbia, I was stupefied by the amount of catching up I had to do.
This is despite having gone to an elite school.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
But there's some very distinguished graduates, of
yeah, Shelley Glashow,
Nobel laureate, and
Nobel laureate, and Stephen Weinberg went there.
Nobel laureate.
A whole raft of people, but that was slightly before my time. These were people who graduated in 51, 52. I graduated in 59, and by that time, the entering classes were far more lackadaisical than those very driven people.
And so you do your undergraduate in Columbia in mathematics?
No, I didn't take a single math course in Columbia. Oh no, I knew that would cause a nosebleed if I went to a math course. I studied medieval history with Norman Cantor.
Oh, fascinating. So and then you do your PhD at Princeton,
At Princeton.
in philosophy, but
Philosophy and logic.
logic, and that's how you make the transition into math. Is that because people think of you as a mathematician?
Well,
your PhD was actually in philosophy.
Yeah, I went out to Stanford. You know, this is the time that
Yeah.
jobs was like picking lilies in a valley. You go wherever you wanted. And I got a job as an assistant professor at Stanford, and I became great friends with a mathematician, a Tarski student from Berkeley. His name was Daniel Gallon, and we started collaborating, and that's how I learned mathematics. I learned the rest of mathematics teaching it, which is by far the best way to learn this subject.
Is a great way to learn a subject. So some of David's most famous books are A Tour of the Calculus, Advent of the Algorithm, a book called 1, 2, 3 about the history of math. And so he's very well known for his mathematical prowess, but didn't study it specifically.
Never the other math. The only math course I took Alonzo Church's graduate course in mathematical logic. Didn't understand a word. He could have been talking Chinese as far as I was concerned.
So you have a number of academic appointments after you first finished your PhD, Stanford, San Jose State.
Stanford, Rutgers.
Rutgers, and you taught at even University of Puget Sound, I think, for a year,
Yeah.
Seattle area.
3 years, yeah.
And then you gave up academia. What was behind that?
Well, my academic career was like a downward descending spiral. You know, if you start at Princeton and you wind up San Jose State University, the reflection becomes pressing. Surely I've done something wrong. I had no objection to my students at San Jose. I had very good students, chiefly Vietnamese students, each of whom had a tale of horror to report.
Sure.
I just didn't like the faculty a whole lot, nor they me.
And so also, and I'm not sure if we got the chronology here, but at some point you meet a French mathematician
Schützenberger.
named Marco Schützenberger.
That was through Noam Chomsky.
Yeah.
I was talking, this was the Noam Chomsky of 1970, 1971, who was really fearless, and this was before he discovered the merits of Darwinian evolution. And he was very free to admit, you know, the stuff makes no sense, it's not supported, it's incoherent, it's absurd on its face, and it has nothing to do with the language faculty in human beings. And I said, you know, I agree with every word. I showed him a paper that I had written, and he said, the person you really should speak to is Marcel Schützenberger in Paris. How am I going to get there? I said, I'll take care of it. So Chomsky wrote Schutz and Berger about it.
Chomsky put you in touch with him.
Oh, yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And it's a debt I can never repay. Invaluable.
Glad we're doing this interview. I'm learning some new things.
And Schutz and Berger wrote me in, I forgot where I was. I was in Seattle at the time. And he said, come visit. I said, all right, send me a ticket. He did.
Yeah.
And so I went to Paris, and we hit it off right away. Schutz and Berger at the time, I think he must have been 60. Very lean, very feral, completely French, and cannot imagine a more essential Frenchman than Marcel Schutz and Berger. He did speak English after a fashion, butchering almost every word, but he was very expressive. And also very funny, which was a rare combination. Somebody who does not have a perfect command of a language, yet is capable of being very funny in the language. And of course, he was a devastatingly witty character, and had an enormous sense of himself, of his presence in life, and nothing but contempt for almost everyone else in the academic world. He recognized a few mathematicians as being his superior. The general relativity theorist, Leschnerowitz, for example. He said to me once, when I'm talking with Leschnerowitz, I feel like a chicken dancing with an elephant. Just one plop of that huge foot, and that would be the end of me. But no one else. He knew everyone. He had gossip about everyone. He knew the sex lives of every single academic in the Western world. And he was very willing to talk endlessly about them. And
But he was also
a great mathematician.
a great mathematician and a critic of Darwinism.
And a critic, and fearless critic.
What was the connection there? Why did his mathematical acumen lead him to skepticism about Darwin's theory of evolution? What was it?
Well, there were two reasons. One, he despised Richard Dawkins, which had nothing to do with the merits of the theory. He just took one look at that face and said, I hate it. Which is really the way he talked and the way he thought. He based his life on these kinds of animadversions and stratagems. But Schutz and Berger had done some very important work in computer science. Not hands-on computer science. He was a pioneer in automata theory, which is the abstract version of computer science. And he said, look, we know a certain amount about the way these alphabetic systems really work. And I can tell you, if we made random changes in an alphabetic system governing a computer, it would crash. Wouldn't get a better computer, it just wouldn't work. But why shouldn't the same thing be true when we talk about DNA, when we talk about Darwin's theory of random variations? But he had many criticisms to make, many.
Let me, if I can just stop us there, this is a point where everyone in the audience can understand this key scientific idea. If DNA, and this is in the 1960s, 70s, this is in the immediate wake of the Watson.
I didn't meet him until 73.
73. Okay, so we're still just only 20 years after Watson and Crick. In 1953, Watson and Crick elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule in the famed double helix. In 57, 58, Crick formulates something called the sequence hypothesis, where he proposes that the four chemical subunits on the inside of the DNA molecule that chemists today represent with the letters A, C, G, and T are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or like zeros and ones in a section of software. And so the people like Schutzenberg, Berger, and Murray Eden at MIT, people that have a computer science background, are learning about what the biologists are telling them, that DNA contains digital code for building proteins and protein machines. And they're thinking, well, wait a minute, in our digital software world, if we start changing the zeros and ones in a section of code, we're going to degrade the function of that software long before we can come up with a new program or operating system or anything like that. Are there any computer programmers in the audience? Yeah, okay, so this is just intuitively obvious to people that work in that digital world. And so a lot of these first people that David encountered who were skeptical about Darwinism were skeptical because they realized that if you start randomly changing functional code, you're going to degrade it. Odds are you're going to degrade it.
You're going to crash it.
You're going to crash it and lose function long before you would hope to get anything new.
The organism will die.
Yeah, absolutely. So you start conversing about that, and
Oh, that
many other things.
suggests an equality of conversation, which Schützenberger absolutely refused to accept. His idea of conversation was he would speak, I would listen. And I was very happy to do it. I was very happy to do it. Why doing something wrong?
No, you're doing great. You're doing great.
No, I mean, there's an echo.
Maybe a bit, but I think most people are hearing okay. Okay, good.
Schützenberger, we would agree to meet at 2 o'clock, and he would talk nonstop for 3 hours about anything. He was a brilliant conversationalist, just brilliant, and very funny, as I said. And
So you become sensitized to these mathematical problems associated with Darwinian evolution. And the math works in here because if you think about the odds of getting a random change that will maintain the function of a section of code, it's very, very, very small, okay? People didn't know quite how small at the time that David was talking to Schützenberger. Call him Marco.
or Schutz.
But we have a member of our audience, Douglas Axe. Doug, could you just raise your hand? Who did a research project at Cambridge University for 14 years, carefully testing how much change the DNA molecule could tolerate by way of random change in those characters, the A, C's, G's, and T's, and how rare the functional genes and their corresponding protein products were among all the possible ways there were of arranging the A, C's, G's, and T's and the amino acids that make up proteins. And so it's kind of exciting for me to just have this conversation with David because a lot of these ideas started with Marco, Murray Eden. David, I want to get to this in a minute, wrote a famous essay in 1996. Meanwhile, while he's writing that essay, Doug is testing empirically this intuition that the computer scientists and the math people have about the extent to which you could mutate anything biologically and hope to maintain function. So now fast forwarding, you write an essay then in 1996 for Commentary Magazine called The Deniable Darwin, and you explain some of these ideas, and you also share a concept that is, I think, your own original framing of this. You call it the problem of combinatorial inflation. Would you explain that?
I wish I could claim complete originality, but as with most things, I think I really learned it from Marco. I stress it's very hard to assign proper credit because he talked so much.
Yeah.
And
And you're absorbing all this.
After the third hour or so, I more or less figured it was a spiritual communion so intense I could claim credit for some of the ideas myself, a view I still hold today. But he was talking about, and Murray Eden,
Right.
who is a friend of ours, a professor of electrical engineering at MIT,
MIT, yeah.
we're talking about the space of all possible proteins. And just a back of the envelope calculation indicates that all possible proteins occupy a space roughly 20 to the 250th power. That's a really big number. And Murray Eden asked the obvious question, is every protein in this space useful? Does it play a role? If not, how do you get to this small cadre of competent functional proteins? And he added the tremendously important observation, if the functional proteins are only a small part of this enormous space, then something about the topology of the space must guide them in the right direction. That was a very, very shrewd remark.
Indeed, if they're super rare among all the possibilities, if the functional ones, then a random search through that space is unlikely to find them, right? So the Darwinian mechanism, this poses a challenge to the Darwinian mechanism that relies on a random mutational search.
It shows it's incomplete. That's what it really shows.
Right.
Maybe random changes. Fine, it's a good idea. It's okay. Things generally do begin in these systems in a random state, generically random state.
Let me offer just an analogy for people who may not be as familiar with the biological terms we're using, DNA and proteins. Think of a bike lock, and a typical bike lock has 4 dials on it. The reason the lock works is that there's one functional combination that will open the lock, but with 4 dials, you have 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, or 10,000 possibilities. So the thing you want is, in a sense, hidden in this space of other combinations that will not open the lock. And this is... Exactly right, Howard. And so if you could imagine a lock with 10 dials and only one combination, it's going to get even worse. You're going to have... But what Doug found in doing his research is that for a protein of modest length, that the ratio, the functional sequences to the non-functional gibberish is 1 over 10 to the 77th power. And so this is where the idea of searching randomly through that big, to change the metaphor a little bit, it's like tiny needle, great big haystack, very limited time to work, to look, and it raises a huge challenge to neo-Darwinism. And it's a mathematical challenge because the odds of finding the thing you want are so vanishingly small. Now, David explains all this beautifully in a commentary essay in 1996. And, combinatorial inflation. Can you just, that's...
Well, you just did.
Well, that's kind of, the longer the sequence, the more possibilities there are to search.
Yeah.
The longer, if the byte clock is really long, every new dial increases exponentially the number of possibilities.
Well, we're dealing with explosions.
An explosion. Yeah.
We're really dealing with extremely large number of possibilities. And every part of our experience dealing with systems like that indicates either that we know the answer in advance or that there are real constraints. Murray Eden called them topological constraints. There's something about the space that's guiding these systems. We see that writ very large, for example, with ChatGPT, which has amazing, remarkable powers. And it does begin in a random state. All the layers of neural networks are randomized. They're programs to do that, not true random. They're pseudo-randomized. And it gradually builds up an appreciation, for example, for the syntax of English grammar. But it does so because its parameters are weighted. And it does so because it has a lot of reinforcement training. And it also does so because of enormously powerful computers.
Both of which are the result of intelligent inputs.
Right. So the whole thing is structured. But in Darwinian evolution, there is no prior structure. We're supposed to assume that you have these biological nucleotides or proteins, and they change randomly, and somehow or other the force of natural selection leads to a converging series of improvement.
So you write the essay in 96. What was the reaction to it?
There was a lot of controversy, a lot of bitter controversy, and didn't really enhance my career prospects, I can tell you that. Academic offers began to diminish notably.
Their loss was our gain, David. This is how we learned about you.
This is how we got together.
Yeah. But there were, as I recall, there were letters from Richard Dawkins. There were from all types of, leading American academics. There were a few sympathetic, but
there were a few sympathetics. I have to say that, and there were a very few grateful letter writers who said, "We've been waiting for someone to take on this sacred cow for a long time." But no, I think 1996, if one were sensitive enough, could come to appreciate a change in the diapason of public opinion. The fact that commentary was willing to publish it,
right.
The fact that it did elicit controversy and not an indignant refusal to participate in the discussion, these were all indicative of changes. And I think the changes have only accelerated since that.
Yeah. And Philip Johnson, that was at the time very at the height of his powers, making these powerful arguments in college debates. Doug was quietly beavering away at Cambridge, testing the rarity of genes and proteins in the big space of possibilities and finding them to be as rare as Marco and Murray Eden had suspected. And so it was, I think, a time of some intellectual ferment. And you crystallized all this in the essay. And
I think a lot of different currents were coming together.
It was the year we founded our Center for Science and Cultural Discovery as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
But look, if you look at biology today, molecular biology, or theoretical biology in general, I think it's much healthier in 2024 than it was in 96. Much, much healthier. And I think for the first time, having a physical object undergoing something like Darwinian evolution in terms of ChatGPT 3.5 and 4 gives us a lot of very valuable
A
information.
lot of work to be done there. If we fast forward again to 2016, 20 years forward, at the Royal Society in England, arguably the oldest and most august scientific body in the world, formerly headed up by none other than Isaac Newton, the evolutionary biologists associated with the Royal Society convened a conference in which that was meant to evaluate the current status of evolutionary biology, and it was called by people who were calling for a new theory of evolution because they believed that the Darwinian theory was inadequate. And I think in that 20 years from 96 to 2016, a lot of the arguments that our network of people were making and marshaling were starting to get traction and putting people who were in the mainstream a little bit on notice that they had to start answering some of these deep questions.
I
a
think
lot of
that
it
is
started in
happening.
96.
That is happening. I mean, it's very interesting. It goes both ways. A very interesting talk with Jeffrey Hinton, who is one of the founders of neural networks. And one of the problems with Darwinian evolution has always been, if you imagine a landscape, so-called fitness landscape with peaks and valleys, you've got an organism or a set of organisms traversing that landscape, and the goal is to get high up. Well, how come a lot of life doesn't get trapped on false minima, that is, low-lying peaks, such that to get to the higher peak, you have to descend into a valley and go up again? This has always been a classic objection to the Darwinian theory, mathematical population genetics. And Jeffrey Hinton says something very interesting to which we should pay attention. We all thought this would be a tremendous problem for ChatGPT, for artificial language models, large language model. And he said, turns out it isn't. He didn't say another word. Turns out it isn't. I'd really like to know, and these things for the moment are fairly inscrutable. We don't know how they work. I'd like to know what got around the problem of false minima in large language models. Because whatever was working there seems to be working in life too.
Being designed systems, however.
That's what I'm talking about.
Exactly. We actually, because of David's urging, have a research project on this where we're teaming up some top computer scientists with biologists to look at problems like how would you develop a new protein structure called a protein fold from an existing one where you're essentially going up the hill of complexity. Let me shift gears one more time here in the interest of time. You have famously been involved in formulating the mathematical and scientific critique of Darwinism. There was a big literary movement or a genre of publishing that became very popular in the 06-07 time period and continued for about 10 years, called the New Atheism, with figures like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Lawrence Krauss. And I think between the two of us, we debated most of those guys at one time or another. But
I only debated Dawkins and
you did, yeah, Dawkins and Hitchens. I did Krauss. Jay Richards had a couple with. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Point is, their books became monster bestsellers, and their argument was, Dawkins's argument was actually importantly based on Darwinism. He argued that the best reason that we have for believing in God was always the design argument, because we could see the evidence of design in nature. It was based on publicly accessible scientific evidence. But since Darwin, argued Dawkins, we have no evidence of actual design, only the illusion or the appearance of design, and therefore we don't have actual evidence of a designer, and therefore there's no public evidence of God. Therefore, God is a delusion. It's purely, you can believe in it if you want to, believe in God if you want to, but only on subjective, delusionary grounds. And that was his famous title, The God Delusion. And there was a whole spate of books that followed in the wake of this, God, the Failed Hypothesis, et cetera, et cetera. And David, you took these guys on, and you've made no claim to be devoutly religious. You've described yourself as a secular Jew, but you ended up defending the religious tradition, at least, against these, what you regarded as somewhat facile arguments for atheism. Can you tell us about why you did that
Well,
and your thinking about it?
I learned a lot from Marco. I learned not to deny my own animadversions. I just didn't like these guys. I didn't like Dawkins. I didn't like Krauss. I didn't like Sam Harris, especially because he's a nincompoop. And I didn't like, who was the last one? Christopher Hitchens I liked him a lot. He was an immensely charming guy. He didn't take anything he said seriously except the Iraq War, to his regret. He certainly at the end, I met him when he was terribly ill, and he certainly was no longer vigorous in his atheism, perfectly willing to open himself up to other possibilities.
Even as he was dying.
Especially because he was dying, dying men are prone to snatch at chances, however remote. And my main reason for taking them on, I thought they had, first of all, the real reason that I didn't like, and I wanted to punch them in the nose. And my secondary reason, I think, and I still do think, they had a profoundly unwholesome effect on the culture. These dogmatic asseverations about matters to which none of them could remotely claim competence. First of all, they weren't competent in the sciences, and second of all, they weren't competent in theology. So that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
That leaves me standing pretty free and clear, doesn't it?
Yeah.
As a self-defense.
That's a self-defense. For those of you who haven't gotten a copy of it, I highly recommend it. It's extremely readable. It's whimsically written, and David's inimitable with his sense of humor, but it's very, very clearly argued, and a lot of food for thought. It seemed a big part of the reason for the new atheism was the claim that science was answering the big questions about how the universe got here, how life first originated, and how we got new forms of life. And in the book, you show that's not necessarily true. Either science isn't speaking about those big questions, or
They're not answering.
they're not answering it.
It always reminds me of those wonderful lines in Shakespeare. I forget, is it Henry V? I forget exactly where one character says to the other, I can call the spirits from the misty deep.
Yeah.
And the other character says, well, so can I, so can any man. The question is, will they come when you call?
Yeah.
And that's how I feel about all these. I mean, they can all say science has answered these questions, but even the most superficial examination of the sciences indicates nothing of the sort.
Mm-hmm. So let's just we'll do one little snapshot on this, and then we'll open it up for questions. There's so much more we can talk about. David, well, I'll tell you one other thing, that David is currently working on a book with a very prominent mathematician from Princeton, Sergiu Kleinerman, Romanian Jewish mathematician who's one of the top mathematicians in the world. And they're writing a book defending, I guess you would say, mathematical Platonism, the idea that math is not a material thing, it's a conceptual thing, and therefore it must ultimately reside in some kind of ultimate mind. Is that roughly the...
Any collaboration has certain points of friction. I'm not sure. I think Sergei would agree with you.
Yeah.
Just leave it at that and say, but that's because of his perfect ignorance of the philosophy behind it. He's a mathematician after all. We do argue in the end that the distinction between mathematical and physical objects is not a distinction in kind but degree. That the more precise you make a description of a physical object, the closer you will get to a mathematical description. So ultimately, the ontology may be universal. There is only one class of objects, mathematical objects.
So thought is superior to matter in a way.
I've always held that.
You've always held that. Yeah. When David introduced me to Sergei at a conference a year ago, and had told me that he had appreciated my book, Return to the God Hypothesis, and I thought that couldn't possibly be true. When I met Professor Kleinerman, he told me he did appreciate it, but he had a quibble. And he said, your subtitle was 3 discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. He said, you forgot one. It's the math, he says. So it's interesting how many mathematicians, going back to Gödel as well, have had theistic leanings. There's something real about the universe that's mathematical, but it's conceptual and not material.
And it's the only thing real.
So say some mathematicians. All right, one last thing. Let's just check the time, make sure. You know, I'll tell you what, let me just commend to you the Devil's Delusion. I think, given the interest of this group, I think this is one of David's books that you will most enjoy. And he takes on the new atheists in a vigorous way. And there is a kind of tacit defense of, well, more than tacit defense of the religious tradition, but even of a theistic view of some of the key issues like the origin of the universe or the origin of life, where our colleague Jim Tour has been taking on some of these staunch atheists.
I mean, my own view is simple. We don't have a prayer of understanding these things.
Yeah. You start in the preface, I remember saying, you know, the default view of these scientists is that everything that exists is the product of a random accident, and yet science shows no such thing.
It's very strange. I mean, I find the contemporary currents of thought, the modalities and modulations, every bit as mysterious as anything in the physical sciences, why they take place, when they do, what they mean, what their interior significance really is. You know, if you look at the great physicists of the early part of the century, they were by no means as dogmatic and as narrow-minded as the physicists of the second part of the 20th century. Einstein had, I wouldn't call them clear, but certainly sympathetic view of religious experience. And so did Niels Bohr, so did Pauli, so did Schrödinger. They were all very, very cultured men, Central Europeans by and large, except for Niels Bohr, who was Danish. And they were not prepared to reject the religious tradition, just as they were prepared to acknowledge that psychoanalysis, for example, in the case of Pauli, might be onto something. All of that seems to have disappeared roughly 1955, and a very intolerant, dogmatic spirit.
Of materialism.
I don't know whether Schrödinger or Pauli or Bohr might not have considered themselves materialists too. That I can't say. But the change
They're more open-minded.
was very noticeable.
Yeah.
As far as I can see, we have nothing like an explanation. There's certainly no great theories about the ways in which ideas change, except for the obvious observation that Berkeley made 300 years ago, that the only thing influencing an idea is another idea. But how that takes place, I don't know.
All right, let's break our part of the conversation here and invite you all to participate with questions, comments, objections. We'll take them all. This gentleman right here got his hand up first. Thank you.
Your parents were musicians.
Yes.
I'm a musician. During the break, there was two beautiful pieces of music from the 17th century. My question to you and to you, do you believe that music transcends everything else?
I'm so sorry. Can you just repeat?
Do you believe music transcends everything else? Because it too goes back to Genesis, when you had the Tower of Babel, and then you also had Jubal, who came along and who was the father of music. And they're only dealing with 7 components. Music has lived all that time, and nothing compares to it. So my question to you is, do you believe it transcends?
I mean, in the same way that math transcends matter, is there something about music that
transcends
the material analysis?
And it's limited. It only has really 7 notes or 7 components, but so much beauty has been created since the beginning of time.
Well, I have a very depressing answer, a sad answer too. When I was growing up, I really grew up underneath the piano. Either my father was practicing like crazy or my mother was practicing. I heard the entire repertoire played on the piano, from Palestrina to Bartok, again and again and again. I heard Chopin endlessly being played. And then when I reached adulthood, I married a musician, a cellist. And I heard the entire cello repertoire played again and again and again. And when I was growing up, my parents desperately wanted me to learn an instrument. And they tried me on the cello, piano, the clarinet, the recorder, the flute, maybe even the trumpet for all the clarinet. And much later, when I was an adult, I asked my mother, I said to her, you know, when I was growing up and you were forcing me to take piano lessons, you told me I was so very talented, it would be a shame not to practice. Did I actually have any musical talent, Mother? And she said, none whatsoever. From that moment on, as I grasped an otherwise elusive truth, my ability to listen to music with pleasure began to diminish, and now it's extinguished. I really don't like listening to music anymore, with a few exceptions. Bach, for example. But I can't comment on the transcendence if my own appreciation proved so evanescent.
This is something else, David, and I have. My grandfather was a very accomplished musician. He was in the original Glenn Miller Orchestra. And I also washed out, he gave me trumpet lessons till I was 16. And when they put the marching band uniforms on you and you had to walk around in the rain, I could not play and walk in formation at the same time. And truth is, I couldn't play well either. So I think we both found other callings. I am surrounded by musicians in my family, so I do appreciate it. And I think I probably agree with you about its transcendent quality, but I'm also in no position to comment on that from any position of personal expertise. Howard, why don't you chime in?
I agree. For example, I heard more than 50 years ago. Everything in the universe, instead from the thinnest single object, what could which is big note.
The big notes. Okay.
Right.
It's kind of like Johannes Kepler, the music of the spheres. Okay, other comments or questions? Yes, right here, this lady.
First of all, I'd love to know if you came from a culturally Jewish family or a religiously Jewish family, and then what are your theological beliefs?
My parents tried so hard. They did insist I have a bar mitzvah, but at a very liberal Reform synagogue, which meant I learned to read Hebrew in a kind of halting fashion. And I was at an age where I could have picked it up instantly. As a young child, you learn languages very quickly. I didn't, because I didn't stick to it long enough. They both had vivid and beautiful memories of religious observances in their houses in Germany, when the entire extended family would gather for Passover. They tried to repeat that, but the extended family was dead, perished in the Holocaust. So there were just the three of us sitting around trying to sing old songs, which I never knew and they had forgotten. It was a very sad kind of experience. Above all, their experiences in Europe made ever more fragile a vivid sense of Jewish commitment. It's a difficult period in history. Everybody was affected by it. Everyone was affected by it, especially European Jews.
What are your theological beliefs today?
I'm sorry?
What are your beliefs today, theologically?
Hope for the best, I guess. I wouldn't, after a lifetime endeavoring to have a good time all the time, I don't want to appear too eager to make amends at the end, because it will be taken as evidence of bad faith, and justifiably so. So I'm prepared at the throne of judgment to say, well, that's the way it was. I wasn't very observant. Judge me as you will.
Hi.
first question is this recorded so that we can share with others?
Yes, I'm wondering the same thing. Is this being recorded? Excellent. Okay. We then will be putting this out on our podcast, ID the Future. That's a podcast out of Discovery Institute. So we'll get a hold of the recording and make sure it gets up. And for people who are interested, link up.
And the second one is Dr. Axe.
Can't hear you.
In listening to Dr. Axe's his research and what you had mentioned, as far as the probability of protein matches, if I'm saying it correctly, is this the reason why evolutionists always talk in terms of billions of years, because they're trying to put it in a framework that it could actually happen? Or how does anyone measure that?
Doug is right here.
Doug, would you answer your question? Yes.
Sure. In fact, the probability that I came up with it was 2004.
Well, what 177 hour. And it turns out that even with 5 billion years, there's no way there's no way you could get a torque that small, even with billions of years. So
It's immaterial what age you take to be the accurate age of the Earth.
Not take time to accomplish a search that difficult.
I think it's excuse me for interrupting you, but I think it's extremely important once you start talking about combinatorial inflation and the magnitude of the space of possibilities, that you realize the difference in magnitude is not incidental. It's huge. 10 to the 77th is a much, much, much bigger number than 10 to the 3rd, 10 to the 4th, 10 to the 5th. We're talking about dramatic differences.
Is it, Doug, 10 to the 65th atoms in our galaxy?
A little more, 10 to the 80th.
Elementary particles in the universe. Yeah.
So we're talking about much larger numbers than that. So it's true that evolutionary biologists do stress the amount of time available and say, well, it can take place in one throw of the dice, but if you have 4 billion years, you can expect the emergence of certain unlikely structures, but not given the true probabilistic space behind life. Not given that. It just becomes wildly implausible. Nonetheless, it's also important to realize here we are. Something happened.
In the middle there.
What are your thoughts on AI in terms of the presuppositions or the logic that's behind?
I'm stupefied by it, and I wish I could tell you I had a completely coherent answer to your question. Look, for the first time in human history, we've got a really artificial mechanical system that's converged on the natural language. It really does produce English or German or French. Those are the languages I've tested it on. Its French is much better than mine, I'll tell you that. It never makes a grammatical mistake, and I make lots. That's a remarkable achievement. If you think about theoretical linguistics, Chomsky's whole school from 1959 to 2014, 2015, where he's working on this very elaborate theoretical system describing English grammar, universal grammar as well. It has never been implemented on a computer, and yet you have these systems, these large language models, that have never been implemented in Chomsky's system that work very, very well. They speak English. I find that just an incredible, remarkable achievement. Part of the problem is we don't know how these systems work. We don't have a really good idea. We know that they're very large, billions of parameters. They're very highly tuned. We know matrix multiplication is involved as an operation because computers are very good at that, and we're not very good at that. We have a kind of rudimentary idea of what reinforcement learning is like in these systems. But beyond that, we have no ability to enter into the black box and say, this is what the system is going to do. No ability at all. Maybe we'll have it in 50 years, but right now we don't have that ability. So it's very hard to know what actually is going on. I have a suspicion that it means the eclipse of theoretical linguistics and all the categories of theoretical linguistics. Because these systems are not going, let's see, subject here, verb here, predicate there, adjective there, head there. No, they're not. They're looking at a vast amount of data and picking up statistically significant clues. Exactly what Chomsky said couldn't be done. I remember it vividly, he said it to my face. He said, you take a sentence, you leave off the last word, what's the probability of finding it? There is no probability, it's meaningless. Probability is infinitesimal. He was wrong. He was just wrong.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's right here.
Well, almost.
Yeah. But my question is, you say some.
I think that we make a very considerable mistake in denying the existence of an essential human nature. Essentialism is the word of reprobation. You know, it's considered indelicate to be an essentialist with respect to races, culture, civilization, because, God forbid, this might suggest that one civilization, race, or culture is superior to another because it has certain essential properties. I think that's probably true, as unpleasant a development as it may be in terms of social policy. But I think when it comes to human beings, there is an essential identity that we all share that can't be fudged, can't be removed, can't be transfixed, can't be transformed. That's just what it seems to be. It's necessary, therefore it's impossible to change it. I think that was my motivation to somehow get to that point. And of course, I'm very much in a minority in holding those views.
There's a connection there, too, to the critique of Darwinian evolution, because one of the propositions of Darwinism was the denial of essentialism, of an essential nature, of a pre-given design for humans that would distinguish us from other forms of animals. In the Darwinian scheme of things, every biological form is infinitely elastic. It can morph and change and evolve. And so with Darwinism came a denial of essentialism, and therefore a denial and loss of confidence in the idea that there is a human nature. And I think David's book beautifully defends the idea that there is a human nature.
Don't forget, Darwin, the title of Darwin's book is On the Origin of Species, and species are abstract objects, and Darwin realized that, according to his own theory, species don't exist. All that exists are individuals, which settles the problem that he posed in The Origin of Species in the best possible way. There is no problem because there are no species.
So
Some people might think
a little
that,
bit like the atheist argument about the origin of the universe that you critique in the book. The atheist, the materialist doesn't really have an explanation for the origin of the universe. They've just argued that, well, we don't need to explain it because there could be an infinite regress of material causes going all the way back, and therefore there's no need to explain it because we've explained away the problem.
You could say there's no need to explain the origin of the universe because some things just have to be accepted. Why not accept the existence of the universe as one of them? I think that's a perfectly reasonable argument. Demurral comes as a matter of taste, not logic. There's no need to take the inferential step from the universe to what caused the universe. You're disposed to accept the universe as it is.
Others? Let's take one more in the back, and then we'll adjourn.
Nay again. Oh, there we go. If your chance of having something viable is 1 in 10 to the 77th, what's the chances of finding a mate? Because we often think about, oh, here's the one that's different, but we don't think about if they don't reproduce, what happens? You know, if we have different chromosome counts, the offspring are usually not fertile, right? How do you get the next generation and have to have that mutant? Because is it, 10 to the 154th?
Well, because the discussion is so abstract, usually in population genetics, it has to be lowered down to specific case study
a sexually segregated case study. There's a lot of mathematical stuff on it. But Doug's question, Steve's question, my question are simply a further stage back. If we're talking about numbers in the order of 20 to 250, that's all protein combination, or 10 to the 77, and we're talking about the number of seconds between the Big Bang and the end of the universe, and we see that these are wildly incommensurable, there's an antecedent problem that precedes question about finding a mate.
Way. Doug in particular has done is analyze the Darwinian mechanism by reference to a very tractable, seemingly tractable problem. How do you build a new protein structure called a protein fold? To build any organism, you need lots of new protein folds. And if you can't build a protein fold in the allowable time by the mutation selection mechanism, you can't get anywhere. So questions of the origin of mating or sex, male and female, that's so far downstream.
I think that's absolutely
that this is why Darwinism is in trouble, and why you have leading evolutionary biologists saying, hey, we do need a new theory. So one of many reasons.
with no evidence that a new theory will do anything.
Yeah. Well, they've tried new theories and they're not working either.
Yeah, it's very strange. I mean, I don't think in science as an institution, just going back 300 years to Newton, really, there's ever been a situation in which the expectation that a certain group of anomalies will be resolved by a new theory seems itself to be under suspicion. We certainly have an intimation of that when you consider the task facing theoretical physics to somehow reconcile gravity and particle physics. Not that it's success. No one really thinks a success is going to be forthcoming, but it's far more vivid in the case of origins of life or the maturation of species. It may be the case anomalously, given the history of science, that there does not exist an X, such X is an explanatory theory that will explain why. It just doesn't exist.
In my book, Darwin's Doubt, I not only looked at classical neo-Darwinism, but 8 other new theories of evolution that are similarly incapable of explaining the key things that need to be explained,
No.
like the origin of the information necessary to build a new protein. Let's adjourn. Thank you for your rapt attention.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for